Hello. Welcome to the third seminar in the History of the Present series at SAIS Europe this year. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Mark Gilbert. I'm Professor of History and International Studies at SAIS Europe. And tonight I'm going to be presenting a seminar by Kiran, Klaus, Patel of the University of Munich. Now, the object of this series is twofold. We're trying to look at the first drafts of history, i.e. events, developments that are clearly going to be defining in the here and now for the future, and which historians will one day or other will write about. We're also going to be looking at the historical context of terms that are often used in contemporary policy and political debate, and which have a relevance, and looking at the historical context in which they were developed. Now, our first seminar some time ago was by SAIS's own Dan Markey, and he talked about China's hegemonic aspirations in Central Asia, placing them in historical context. The speaker was Agustin Menendez of the Autónoma in Madrid, a political philosopher and jurist who looked at the current crisis of the EU through the lens of the concept of crisis. Well, today's seminar will look at the idea of the New Deal. And we hear this all the time. A New Deal for Africa, a New Deal for relaunching the global economy, etc. In some ways, I often think it rivals a new Marshall Plan as a metaphor for spending lots and lots of public money. One could actually say, I think, that, and I'm quoting from our guest speaker's book now, that the concept of a New Deal lingers on, increasingly adrift from its historical mooring. Well, it struck me that it'd be a good idea to have somebody who could remind us about the original New Deal and tie it back to its historical mooring, if we like. But also somebody who could present the New Deal outside of its obvious historical context, which I think most people would assume to be 1930s America, or even American history more generally. One of my favorite books, not least because it's just quite simply the most perfectly planned narrative history ever written, is Arthur Schlesinger's The Coming of the New Deal. But he locates the New Deal as part of the American radical tradition. My guest will no doubt correct me on that. And I thought it would be very interesting to look at the New Deal in a global, or at the very least transatlantic context to explain its importance. Now, our speaker tonight, Kiran Patel, was the logical choice. Kiran is Professor of European History at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, after previously having been Professor at Maastricht University and the European University Institute. And I believe I'm right, he started his career at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He's the director of Project House Europe, the interdisciplinary research center for European studies in Munich. And his research spans three main yet overlapping, oddly enough, areas: social history, or perhaps more accurately, the history of social policy of Nazi Germany, the history of European integration, but particularly from the point of view of social policy. And in fact, just recently, he published a very important book, European Integration, Project Europe, a history, with Cambridge University Press, to great acclaim. And last but not least, what you might describe as the global New Deal. In fact, Kiran's book, The Global New Deal, The New Deal, A Global History, was published by Princeton University Press in 2016. It has been translated into Italian and perhaps other languages, but certainly into Italian. And it won the 2017 prize, the World History Association prize for best book in the field of global history. So quite aside from these professional accomplishments, Kiran is a terrific speaker and a good friend. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have him in the series. And one thing I'm quite certain of is that we're going to be learning a lot, not only about the New Deal, but about the utility of studying history for those of us who study international affairs. Thanks, Kiran. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, for both the invitation and this very kind and generous introduction. I would have much preferred to be with you in Bologna, obviously, but I think this is second best, and also very grateful to still be able to speak with you at SAIS Johns Hopkins. And again, it might also reflect the situation that we're in and the hopes that we all have for new policy solutions, including the new language and the new talk about new deals all around the world, be it in the European Union, be it in the United States, be it for other parts of the world, such as Africa, as Mark has already mentioned. And if you will, what I'm trying to do tonight is a little bit of an archaeological exercise to go back to the original New Deal first and talk about the past. And then from there on, move further closer to the present. And I'm just trying to switch on my presentation. I hope this will work to take us to the next slide. Now this is, yeah, I think working. So I will start with a quick insight and summary into the global dimensions of the New Deal. As Professor Gilbert has already mentioned, there is, of course, an American story to be told here, and it is often told as an American story, the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But my argument is, in the book that Mark was kind enough to mention, that there is a global history that also deserves mention. And from there, I would like to take you to a second step that really is about then the global projections of the New Deal, because the argument will there also be that the very reason, one of the main reasons why today even we talk about New Deals has to do less with developments in the 1930s when the New Deal was on, but rather with developments in the first half of the 1940s into the second half of the 1940s, when there was a new constellation, new policy solutions that still were then to some way associated with the New Deal. And that will take me to my third part, then the New Deal as a global icon, which will connect history, if you will, to the present as part of a history of the present, and also discuss what we can learn from this history. With that, I would like to take us to the first of these three parts, to again, the global dimensions of the New Deal. And again, for those of you who might be graduate students or students doing American history, I would like to remind you that Mark was quite right by saying that Schlesingers and many others who've written about the New Deal have basically done so by explaining US-American history with other parts and parcel elements of US-American history. So what, if you will, there is an undercurrent of exceptionalism that America is different and hence only American history can help to American developments. And that is also what you find in this literature very much.
Kiran, sorry, just to interrupt you. We've got a problem with your slides. I don't know if your slides have come up. Can you reshare?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, happy to if I'm able to do so. So you can't see the slides anymore at all?
No.
How do I?
You apologize.
I do think that it's not up to me, that it's something your administrator has to do, because I can end my presentation, but for me, it shows me it's on. I'll try again. Let me see.
Okay.
Right. Is it better now? Yeah, sorry about that then. The problem is that there is this American centrism, if you will, in the research on the New Deal. And I argue that, of course, there is a lot that can only be explained when you're interested in the New Deal by looking into early developments and broader structures of US-American history, but that there are also very important global dimensions to this history. Let us remind us of this period when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. This is the spring of 1933. We do, of course, are situated in the period of the Great Depression, which I would always understand as a double crisis of both democracy and capitalism, and where the New Deal basically tried to find an answer for both of these challenges to the global condition. I would also like to say that I do not think that the New Deal was very much defined by a very clear policy approach, such as Keynesianism, for instance, or liberalism broadly conceived, I would want to stress that the New Deal both spent and saved, alleviated and aggravated the economic crisis. It fought but also facilitated racial discrimination. What it did, I think, consistently, this is for me the core of the definition of the New Deal, was to make the US government and the state more generally matter more in Americans' lives. So this is basically my definition of what the New Deal was all about. And to be slightly more specific and precise, I would like to take you to my next slide. I would argue that there is particularly two dimensions that define the New Deal, and they were all basically geared towards one common purpose. On the one hand, what I call insulation, a rather strange word, and secondly, domestic intervention, and this was all about security. Insulation, with that I mean that the Great Depression after 1929 was seen by many dealers as a problem with the world and with American engagement with the world. So the idea was to isolate US policies and the US economy to a larger extent from these global forces and problems. So in that sense, it is not the usual argument that you have about isolation, but rather about insulating the economy in a proper sense. And to be as brief on the second dimension, the main instrument that the American government under Roosevelt was using at the time, I would argue, was domestic interventions, interventionist policies in all kinds of issues, the economic sphere, obviously, but also social policy making that was then also looming very large. Work creation, industrial policy, social security, agriculture policies would be some of the examples in this context. And the overarching goal to which these two dimensions of policymaking were basically contributing to was security. But again, it is interesting and important to remind us what security meant, and security is a notoriously vague term and open concept. It was very much about securing the life of Americans, again, the insecurities of the age, and particularly economic challenges and problems. So it was not so much in a military, international policy sense of security. My argument is also that the New Deal state after 1933 was emphatically civilian, that the military played hardly any role, and that this is, of course, very different to the post-45 or 1940, I should say 41, global role that the United States came to play just a few years later. It is also this domestic focus of New Deal policymaking that I stress here in the slide that makes it so easy to overlook the very global dimensions of these policies. That might also explain why people such as Schlesinger really tells this story of where the New Deal came from and what it did as a very American story. Now, my argument again is somewhat different. I argue that the first half of the 1930s were marked in the United States by profound insecurity about US internal order and about its role in the world, most visibly in the field of the economy with the Great Depression, but also with clear implications for the political system. There was, I would argue, at the time in the United States, a widespread feeling and perception that other political and economic systems might, at least might, be more dynamic in overcoming the crisis than the American. There was, so to speak, the fear of lagging behind global trends. It was not the idea that America was a global model and had something to share, but rather that there was a problem also in comparison to other policies elsewhere. Now, this is again one way of summarizing this. If you look at Dorothea Lange's kind of photos from the 1930s, what she summarized in her kind of very important and powerful pictures was an America in crisis, whereas, of course, countries like the Soviet Union, in a very different political system as a dictatorship, were very powerful in propagating themselves as successful countries that were not really harmed by the global crisis. Now, we know about all the terror of Stalinism. There is also recent research shows that also economically, the Soviet Union was much more affected by the economic crisis than we've long thought. But the perception in America and amongst New Dealers, again, is what I'm trying to focus on here. And that was markedly different. Again, also in Europe, and particularly in Europe, there was the feeling amongst New Deal policymakers that there were very fascinating new experiments in economic and policy making more generally. And particularly rightist dictatorships were often seen as more dynamic forces, including Italy, for instance, where fascism and dictatorship were not clearly seen as the evil as we have then started to see it, at least since post-45. So also my exercise in working on the New Deal is basically an exercise of historicization, of going beyond the categories that we use for this period, which again parcels out the past quite neatly into dictatorships and democracies, and to see that for actors at the time, also for policymakers, the reality was much more blurred and the distinctions less clear. Again, Italy, from the perspective of 1933, was a former brothers in arms in World War I. The term dictatorship was also not so clearly defined as something terrible. There were still people who remembered that in ancient Rome, dictators were crisis managers in the late Republic, for instance, and hence there was a lot of ambivalence as to how one should react to these new trends of policymaking there. So there is this level of fascination that I think we need to remind ourselves of, with people like American economist Saud Chase, for instance, asking, and this is a quote, "Why should Russians have all the fun of remaking the world?" So particularly political scientists, economists, policymakers who felt that state intervention, something else than a classical liberal state, should be the way forward, felt that those countries that strongly intervened in their societies, particularly dictatorships, again, of the left and the right, had something to say, and that America was really lagging behind. And even Roosevelt himself felt, and I quote him, sympathy and confidence with Mussolini until the mid-1930s, calling him an admiring Italian gentleman, which is, again, very different from the perspective that we have on Mussolini today, or that we tend to associate with American policies vis-a-vis fascism. Now, this is the widest scene and the backdrop I think that we first need to see to understand that there was at the time a very thick transatlantic layer with US Americans against the backdrop of this perception of crisis being interested in policy solutions in Europe and elsewhere, but particularly in Europe. There was also a massive presence of Europeans in the United States at the time. So Raymond Unwin, a British housing expert, would only be one. Adrien Tixier from the International Labour Organization in Geneva on social security issues would be another. People who were invited to speak in Washington, to meet the president, some of them at the White House, to really advise the US government on how one could possibly learn from European experiences. Now, my argument is not, let me be very clear on that Americans, and the New Deal is more specifically, simply copied European policy solutions one-to-one. That sadly did not happen. And even in the case of public housing, which is quoted here, there are very interesting and complex processes of transnational adaptation. So what you have in this case is a man named Nathan Strauss, who was the first director of US Housing Authority under the New Deal, who argued that the American law on US public housing was, and I quote him, modeled on the most successful public housing experience of the world, that of England. Now, research has shown, and I would agree with Daniel Rogers and others who've started to look into this, that again, if you look at the practices, what the Americans did was actually quite different, because in the United Kingdom, public housing was basically addressing a different social class than in the United States. It was much less working class centered, what the Americans did, than the British original, and focused only on the very poorest in the United States. So in that sense, no one-to-one process. And there is also other cases where you could say, in a rather schematic way, you see exactly the other way, processes that work the other way around, i.e. that you have a rather strong inspiration by a policy from another country, but it's not really discussed in public. And this is one example that I'd like to give you. Again, this is not so much about the transatlantic link, but more the inner American, the hemispheric dimension of policymaking, where some of you might know the Mexican development and art history with muralists such as Diego Rivera was very powerful at the time. And now it is interesting that, again, these ideas had an impact on New Deal policymaking, also due to the personal politics that Roosevelt himself very much liked. He had an old school friend from the private school that he had attended many years before he became president, who wrote a letter to the president. This was a man by the name of George Biddle, an artist himself, who argued that he had seen very interesting policy programs in Mexico and that Americans should do something similar. Now, I've given you this New Deal mural from California, which I find particularly ironic, because this is again about California's independence from Mexico, but the style and the very fact that this is publicly funded is something that is very much inspired by Mexican policies that had already kicked in 10 years earlier. So Mexico had started to fund artists to do this mural art and had also developed a certain artistic style that impacted the Federal One program in the United States. So with that, I'm just trying to say that there is a very complex process of transnational conversation that the United States is taking part of, where the Americans don't see themselves, the New Dealers particularly, as the ones that have a message to share, but rather more at the receiving end of policymaking. And that is, I think, very important in this context. Now, again, I've already stressed that it's not about one-to-one copies, but rather I'm talking about piecemeal adaptation with these paradox effectors. And there is another thing that I find very important to avoid misunderstandings. Now, in looking around the world for policy solutions, as the Americans did, sending experts to Sweden, to France, to Britain and other countries, there was never the idea to basically go for internationalist solutions at the time. It was rather to shop around for the best national solution against the backdrop of an international crisis. This is also meant with insulation. So it is not an international credo that really drives the New Deal during its first years after 1933. Now, this already takes me to the second part of my presentation, because I really also want to talk about legacies. And this is very much about US projections since the late 1930s and during the war years. And again, I would like to start with historiography, also in this section, as I did in the one before. My point is that the period that I described so far, this period of insecurity and also of trying to learn from other countries, was rather short. And it only took a few years until a new self-perception and feeling came to dominate New Deal policymakers and New Deal public discussions. And I think it is interesting that this second phase has very much impacted on historiography, which also then has basically re-inscribed their impressions on the New Deal more generally. And David Ekblad, a very kind and interesting colleague, would serve as an example for this, because this is very much a book that talks about the Tennessee Valley Authority as one of the iconic New Deal policy programs, as something that was seen as a model for the world, as selling America to the world, also in the fight against totalitarianism. And I would agree with David that this is what the Tennessee Valley Authority started to do from the late 1930s onwards, right? But my argument is also that in the early 1930s, when the program was set up in 1933, there was a very different atmosphere, and it was very much more about catching up with global developments than really pioneering and having a global mission. So in that sense, there is a quick move into a different atmosphere and direction, and that is what parts of the historiography that looks at America in the world from the 1940s onwards has also missed. And I think there is also a methodological dimension that I find very important, that it was easy to miss that because a lot of that research basically only works with sources by American actors, with US sources, which obviously then replicate the perspective of those actors and doesn't look very much at the receiving end, at all these others in other parts of the world that were interacting with Americans, and where again the idea that America had a mission and the mission also basically was accomplished at some point, is then often the impression one gets from the research also, because again, that is also what American actors in the 1940s and 50s try to tell themselves. So this is part of the problem, and I will now kind of go a little bit into the details for the second period, which I find very important. Again, what you have basically is a different atmosphere in the United States. If you will, it was not least the transnational imports of policymaking solutions that helped America to overcome the crisis, not in a big way. We know that the crisis lingered on, but the sense of urgent crisis was over by the late 1930s. And that also helped to create this new atmosphere of having a new model to share with the world. And this is just one ad of the time also here in a very, if you will, quite sad confrontation between realities on the ground and images projected at the time. But the idea was that there was an American model, an American way, not only for the country itself, but also to be shared in the world. With, for instance, the Tennessee Valley Authority trying to propagate something as a model for other countries, and the same holds true for Social Security and other issues. Now, when it comes to the New Deal and the focus of this presentation, I think that what we have is something very interesting, because my argument for this part of the presentation is that it is only now that the New Deal fully became the New Deal, if you will, right? As I said before, the early part of the New Deal proper till 1937, the period that we tend to call the New Deal, was a hodgepodge of very different measures, some of which were state interventionist, others less so. Some of them focused on spending, others on saving, and so on. And it was now that the very state interventionist logic kicked in to a much larger extent. And one example for this is the so-called GI Bill of 1944. Some of you will be familiar with it. Again, it was about giving easy access to the job market and to higher education for veterans, which was then soon seen as one of the best examples of New Deal policymaking. Again, a policy that was not part of the real New Deal, if you will, but only in a later period became policy of the American government. So it was more New Dealish, if you will, than the New Deal itself, and that really matters. So if you will, the war and the dynamics that the war unleashed in the United States, I would argue, helped to compress the rather disjoint elements that had been created since 1933. And if you will, by looking back from the 1940s, everything only now started to appear consistent and convincing in that early period. So the New Deal only fully now became the New Deal itself. It is also interesting that now, of course, the insulationist streak, where again, you reduced migration and you also had a self-centered economic policy, for instance, by going off the gold standard with detrimental effects for China and other places, was to some extent changed. And there was again a new start that took this into a more internationalist dimension. Now, this is the period that I think is so relevant for understanding why we talk about a New Deal also today, because there is this new self-confidence and the mission, the idea to share something. And that becomes very obvious with actors such as Frida Kirkway, for instance, editor of The Nation, who argued in 1944, and I quote her, that only a New Deal for the world, more far-reaching and consistent than our own faltering New Deal, can prevent the coming of World War III. So this is the language of 1944. It's not the language of 1934. And that remains very powerful also during the second half of the 20th century into our own present time. So it is also ironic what we see going on then, because my argument is that while the New Deal and the policies of the 1930s became much more controversial domestically, and there was no new big policies into the post-war era after the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945 that directly continued this, there was the idea to project these policies around the world. Again, with, for instance, the Social Security Board, which is one of the main New Deal institutions, Arthur Altmeyer as director, traveling the world and trying to convince others that the social policy model that the United States had now created was a model for Bolivia, for Colombia, for Mexico, for Panama, for Japan, for Canada, and other places. So again, learning and taking expertise in from Europe and other places, there was now a global sense of mission. And again, the Tennessee Valley Authority would be another interesting example in this context. So I think this is a very interesting move that we also have in this period, where in a nutshell, what you see is also many of these actors move from welfare state building within the United States during the 1930s to becoming architects of globalism in the 1940s. And one, maybe the most famous example, I can only give you one, there are many more in my book, is Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who then became a very important actor in the 1940s with her contribution to the UN General Assembly, to the then Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document with generally universal claim, but that also had deep commitments to an American vision of how human rights were to be defended. Again, quite unthinkable to have her play that role some 10 years earlier, but this is what you then see in the 1940s onwards. And again, this stem from Israel just shows that there is also a global resonance with these new policies, that there is an interest in other countries across the globe in what the United States is doing. Now, it is again interesting to look into the biography slightly more specifically, as I did for this research. And what I found is that, again, many of these New Dealers who now turned into global politicians and administrators were not so much doing because everything at home was supporting them, rather because they were marginalized in their policies and ideas at home. And hence the globe was, if you will, a surrogate for policymaking back home, and that also explains their role. I could give you a lot of details with also people who were marginalized in policymaking during this period. I think I will skip this part just to argue again that this is the period, the 1940s, which again shows that the New Dealers had this global direction and dimension and started to project their ideas globally. Now, coming back to the introductory remark of the second part, that one should not confuse American projections of power and ideas with effect on the ground, I would like to give you just one example. This is an iconic 1945 meeting between Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And again, it is interesting for many reasons, including the role the United States continued to play in Saudi Arabia to this very day, but also because there was a very interesting conversation going on between these two men at the time. Again, Roosevelt, for instance, raved after having seen the deserts, and again, he only had started traveling globally 1 or 2 years earlier, about greening the Arab deserts by setting up Tennessee Valley Authority-like dams and irrigation systems. And he again had this idea that, you know, we can sort this out for you. If you follow our model, this will become a green country, if you will. And then it was interesting how Ibn Saud reacted to that, because he remarked rightly that he was actually not interested in these American ideas, particularly if, and I quote him, this property would be inherited by the Jews. Now, there is a very anti-Semitic dimension to his answer, driven by recent discussions at the time about resettling Jews from Europe in the region, combined, however, also with a love for the spiritual quality of the desert that he had, having grown up there. And that was fundamentally different from a Roosevelt who'd grown up in the fertile lands of the Hudson River Valley and who loved trees. So in that sense, also there, if you will, in this one moment, you see a confrontation of very different ways of seeing the world in all its dimensions. And also, I could quote many other sources of people arguing that New Deal ideas, you know, maybe sounded nice on paper, but didn't make any sense to be implemented in other parts of the world. Polish refugee circles in the 1940s arguing that the US approach was too pattern homely, too idealistic, and oversimple, or other people like Hayek, the very important economist who'd grown up on the lovely riverbanks of the Danube in Vienna, arguing that the American ideas of a Tennessee Valley Authority for the Danube made no sense at all because Americans didn't understand Europe, if you will, and the idea didn't make any sense. And actually, this idea also didn't materialize. Or let me, for instance, refer to Arnold Toynbee, who after traveling to Afghanistan and the Helmand Dam there, saw there was a piece of America inserted in the Afghan landscape. So there were also people who thought there was a model. But again, what you see if you look into the processes of what happened in Afghanistan then, that again, there was no one-to-one copy. It was a very piecemeal adaptation, which very specific local dynamics fully kicked in. So in that sense, also this second section basically ends with a reminder that we need to be very careful that we don't replicate the problems of a US-centric form of research by only looking at Americans and the way they projected powers, but at the same time also looking into this period, because this is the period, I would argue, when the idea of the New Deal as a term to replicate globally with new policy solutions for Africa, for Asia, for Europe, for wherever, started to fully kick in. This brings me to my third part, and I would here like to talk about the New Deal as a global icon. Now, there were already interests and ideas and people arguing in the 1930s that, again, this new policy approach by the United States could serve as a model for policies elsewhere. Again, the replica of the Washington Monument in the Dominican Republic in 1936 on the occasion of a state visit by Roosevelt is only one example where General Rafael Jefe Trujillo kind of also tried to fashion himself as a New Dealer, and many others across the world also did so at the time. And of course, from there, fast forwarding into the Cold War period, there were many, many moments, and I will not list all of them to you, in which policymakers, experts, and others have argued for a New Deal for whatever the context they were talking about. I'll give you a few examples. In 2000, for instance, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called for a global New Deal to remedy the imbalances between the world's rich and poor countries. And in a similar vein, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown argued some 9 years later for, and I quote him, a global New Deal whose impact can stretch from the villages of Africa to reforming the financial institutions of London and New York. In 2013, the European Union demanded a New Deal for Somalia. Meanwhile, the global G7 plus promoted a New Deal for the Congo. There were also more specific programs that were basically organized along New Deal lines. So where, for instance, the idea of having a valley authority, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, was something that also kind of impacted the language and the reform policies of many other countries. And maybe just to give you the most recent updates and then come to a more analytical part, are these two moments when Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez unveils the Green New Deal resolution in 2019 in Washington, D.C. And again, you'll all be familiar with these images. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also talking about a European Green Deal. She leaves out the new, but I think it's very clear that she also refers to this in this context. Now, my argument in this context is the following. I argue that the symbolic references do say rather little about concrete parallels and inspiration from the actual New Deal. The original's complexity already implied emulation, as I said before, and changing historic context and shifting needs worked to the same effect. On the detailed and specific level, the various programs and projects share little, I would argue, with the original New Deal. So all these ideas from the post-war period, again, from the 50s, 60s into the 2000s and our own days, have not so terribly much in common. However, there are certain elements, I think, that explain why the New Deal has remained such a powerful icon in policy making. And I would like to highlight particularly three things. Firstly, I think it has to do with the high level of mobilization that the New Deal stood for. So what Roosevelt also said is that bold and persistent experimentation was more important than having a consistent philosophy. And what he did and what the New Dealers actually did was exactly that they tried out a whole host of things, sometimes contradictory, but the idea was to really have a powerful, a strong answer to this double crisis of their time, the crisis of democracy and of capitalism. The Civilian Conservation Corps, with young men basically across the country running around with spades and trying to not only improve the environment, but also create a new form of masculinity, a new kind of society, again, very 1930s ideas, but stand for a form of mobilization that I think people very often associate with the New Deal also today. And that makes it such a powerful emblem for policymakers. The second reason I think that has to do with this is that the New Deal, and that also rightly so, is very much associated with domestic intervention, that it is an active state, it is an active body of policymaking that is referred to in these programs. Again, no wonder that a Democrat and no wonder that the Commission President of the European Union stand for these policies, because they argue that policy solutions are needed. Somebody like Hayek, whom I mentioned before, and neoliberals who would then be referring to him would have hated these ideas. So on the liberal or neoliberal right, you would never find people positively referring and citing the New Deal experience very obviously. And the third element, which I find as important and takes up something that I've mentioned before, and that is the role of international institutions, with the example of Ursula von der Leyen and also the United Nations, is that the experience of the 1940s and not the original New Deal were actually also something that impacted public discussions. So as I said before, the original New Deal of the first half of the 1930s was not internationalist. The best example for this is the 1933 World Economic Conference in London, where the New Dealers, and it was Roosevelt himself, basically killed economic cooperation by going off the gold standard. So the idea was first to save the American economy and then sort out global problems, but not really put global problems and global coordination and international cooperation front and center. But that experience basically is not cited when people talk about a New Deal today. It is rather, as I try to explain in the second part of my presentation, this later period. Again, the same president, but it was no longer the president of the New Deal. It was Dr. Win the War, as Roosevelt himself called himself during the war years, who was now being referred to. A policy approach that was different after having sorted out the crisis domestically to some extent, and with this new, more missionary spirit of really having a solution for the world, and then also trying to create a new level of international cooperation. Again, something that was very much an approach that Roosevelt stood for in the last years of his presidency until he died in 1945, and that also his successors picked up with the creation of this new range and whole kind of series of international institutions, for instance, in the context of the Bretton Woods organizations and many other things. But again, my argument is that this is actually not the New Deal proper. It is rather something that happened later, but where memory, if you will, is a bit blurred by taking this, importing this into the New Deal experience and forgetting about the insulationist streak that the New Deal actually had. And again, it is this very reason that also explains why not only national politicians like Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, but also people in international organizations so often cite the New Deal. Again, in the United Nations with people like Kofi Annan, in the European Union with Ursula von der Leyen and others, because again, it also seems to for them a powerful emblem that might lead to new powers and competencies for their own institutional formats because of this context. So in that sense, again, I would want to argue, and with this I come to the end, that the New Deal, of course, is a very specific period in American history, that it stands for a very specific experience that can only be explained by looking back into the 1930s. And my argument is that we can't look at America only, American history only, to explain this experience of the New Deal. We need to see it in its global context and its interconnections with other parts of the world. But it is, again, from this very period that now, and as a effect of this, we do have these new discussions about a New Deal, and it is useful to go back to the term. But it is also very obvious that the ideas that are being proposed under the umbrella in their specificities are often quite different, but the spirit is one that, again, to some extent reflects the New Deal, but in some respect is also quite different. So hence it is interesting to look at the starting point, the harbor, if you will, from which this ship started to sail, but the moorings, again, have been left to a large extent. Let me end there, and I look forward to your questions and remarks.
Thank you, Kiran. Perhaps you could take down your slides.
Yes, happy to, sure.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. What I intend to do now, I thought I'd just start off with a couple of questions, and then I would ask our audience, our public, to send me any questions that you might have in the question and answer, using the question and answer function on Zoom, so I can relay the questions to Professor Patel. Kiran, I suppose my first question was fairly straightforward. Well, I'm not sure if it was straightforward. At the time, people used a lot the expression New Deal liberals. To what extent is the American concept of liberalism intimately connected with the experience of the New Deal? Because, I'm writing something actually on Henry Wallace, and yet there was this huge debate. No, I mean, you get Americans for Democratic Action split being created against this. There was almost like a contest for the soul of American liberalism, which came from the New Deal. I just wondered if, to begin with, you could say something about that, because it seems to me this was one of the things, the notion of liberalism, American liberalism, is one of the things that gets exported in the second period that you're talking about.
Can I answer directly, Mark?
Yes, sure, please. Well, I'm waiting for people to send in.
Perfect. Again, I think this is a great question, and probably I'm sure you know more about this than I do. Again, I think the term liberal and liberalism is one of the most complex in the political language, because also the concept doesn't map onto other languages. Again, in Italian, in German, in French, also in British English, there are slightly different notions of this term. So we need to be very clear that this is now about the American discussion, and that debates in other parts of the world would look quite different. I would agree with you that the term has been used quite often, and that there is this discussion about the New Deal liberals. And I would argue that the period also experienced a real struggle over the notion of what it meant to be liberal, and that this was one of the main dimensions of the New Deal inattentions, if you will, that the very nature of liberalism was under discussion. So Henry Wallace, whom you just mentioned already, one of the important New Dealers, again, Secretary of Agriculture for an important period of time, for instance, argued in one important article in the mid-1930s that rugged individualism was nothing American. Again, an idea that most Americans today would find very strange and un-American, maybe even. And again, there were many New Dealers who would not have agreed with him. And I would argue that, again, there is a fight over a rather broad spectrum of ideas that are being associated with liberalism at the time. And what you see is also in this period that I try to highlight in the first part of my presentation, this crisis period, which is the New Deal years from 33 to 37 or so, a fight over very different policy approaches and solutions in practice, but also over terms. And what you have by the end of the decade is a certain convergence of sorts, if you will, and a certain middle ground of ideas, where the more radical ideas of state interventionism and also of social engineering, if you will, do not really stand front and center anymore, and where a more, well, middle road idea of liberalism also emerges. And that is the one that then is being projected on the world. Again, Roosevelt himself, maybe go back to him for a moment, in a very important 1929 article, had already come out as an internationalist and had also basically argued we need internationalist solutions. He had also basically said that one should join the League of Nations. But that kind of policy line was impossible to implement, so he felt, in 1933. And he clearly prioritized national policies over internationalism. There was already this internationalist dimension there, but it was not strong. And that only then came to flourish in the second half of his presidency, particularly during the war years.
That was actually kind of my follow-up, because you're arguing, aren't you, that there was a national period, which paradoxically was extremely influenced by influences from all over the world, in which there was transnational dialogue as the United States tried to learn and was experimenting. It was basically a moment of experimentation. And then the United States regained confidence, and it became something that it could project to the rest of the world. And as it grew in strength, the stronger became the projection. That's the point, isn't it?
That's exactly the argument. Again, I could have summarized it better. What I find particularly interesting, that this nationalist, if you will, period is often described as one of, well, again, domestic concerns. But also, I think there is a split in the literature, if you just talk about the state of the art for a second, that there is, of course, research on diplomacy and international relations and so on, but it doesn't really connect very well with the literature that talks about the New Deal proper. So the New Deal is often only seen as domestic policies of the New Dealers. And my argument is that, again, policies on migration, for instance, or international economic policies, and I briefly mentioned the silver policy, was also very much a policy where you can't really divide between domestic and international. Because, just give one example, the silver policies of the New Dealers led basically to a situation whereby you try to make silver producers in the American West happy, but you very much harmed producers of that commodity around the world, for instance, in China, or also people who were using, also for currency reasons, silver elsewhere. So there was a very clear link and a clear sense of prioritizing. And the same also holds true for, again, issues such as migration, where the very harsh immigration laws of the 1920s were not changed in the New Deal, but rather through smaller acts and kind of administrative issues, it was further hardened the border, particularly to the south. And that was also very much reflecting the idea that first we need to have a solution for America in crisis, and we can't take care of the problems of other parts of the world. And I think that has become forgotten because the internationalist answer that the United States gave from the 1940s, mid-1940s particularly onwards, was so dominant and so important globally that it is so easy to forget that there was this other period that was also very, very intense and where it wasn't clear that it would go this direction, right? That needs to be studied in its own right.
I just had to, I just went offline. Just had a comment come in. What are the constitutional implications of this? It meant increasing the powers of the state. It was an extremely contentious question. How did that feed in? I mean, the domestic policy debate over the constitutional, expanding the Supreme Court, the issue of how large the American state could be, was it compatible with the Constitution, and so forth?
At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned briefly that, again, the state started to matter much more in the lives of average Americans. And if we think about America in the 1920s, or peacetime, I'm talking about peacetime periods of American history prior to 1933, there were what people had national elections. you had some taxes, and you had the post office. And that is where you felt that there was something like a federal state. Otherwise, non-existent mostly, again, in peacetime. And this is what changes massively with these new programs, with this whole alpha-space soup of institutions that the New Deal has created. So in that sense, particularly the federal level became a reality in people's lives in peacetime for the first time with the New Deal, I'd argue. And again, it's not just about policies such as social security or, again, work creation schemes, but also built landscape in America started to look different, with highways and buildings and so on, and not only within the Beltway in Washington, D.C., but also across the country. Now, the second argument connected to this, it would be wrong to think that this was only about the federal state. What you had is a situation where also, because of the way many of the programs were set up, also the individual states gained in powers and became economically, politically, legally stronger. And as Ira Katznetzel, for instance, has shown in a very influential book that came out the same time as mine, some 5 years ago, that also explains the problematic racial legacies of the New Dealers, because again, they had to cooperate with important power players in the South of the United States, Democrats, obviously, for whom the highly problematic racial situation was exactly the way they wanted to continue. And that also reduced the form impetus that some New Dealers, particularly Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, had at the time. Now, from there going on to the constitutional dimension, there is, of course, these famous instances such as the court packing plan. There are ideas of even going further in increasing the powers of the federal government that also led to accusations that the New Dealers were fascists. I think that was never the case and was never really a real threat for America's political system. But it was clear that also there, the system was to some extent for a certain period quite in flux. And it could have gone even further into the direction which it eventually took. And that is of an imperial presidency in which the president plays a much more important role. Again, this was because of this whole host of new domestic policies, but even more so also then, and that is again the second phase we discussed, with again the new global role, with the rise of the military industrial complex, as some have argued, since the 1940s, which gave further scaffolding to the initiatives the United States wanted to take, not only domestically, but also internationally. And that is then a very different period and a very different development. So in that sense, what really mattered and changed America's role basically was discussed much less in constitutional terms, because it had to do with the war dynamics that then kind of created big labor, big industry, big military, and changed the country forever on the backdrop of the New Deal, but also, again, taking it into a very new and different direction.
I would invite people to send other comments. I'm just going to chip in here and follow, in a way, follow on from some of the things you've just been talking about. To this day, race is the American fissure. No, it divides society. It also divided New Deal society, didn't it? It was something that was absolutely, so much of the New Deal was about poor white people, and poor black people, perhaps not so much. Or is that an unfair caricature by somebody who's not an American historian?
I think it goes into a very good direction. Again, unfortunately, I should say so, because the race, again, was also a very big problem in the New Deal. Again, the question is always, what is your yardstick in this context? And again, if you take the situation of, say, 1930, or maybe even 25 before the economic crisis kicked in, I think I would agree with those who would argue that the New Deal brought certain forms of improvement, particularly for African Americans. One example is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was an unemployed work scheme for young unemployed men. And what you had there is a massive overrepresentation of African Americans. So by kind of 50% or 100%, they were overrepresented. Again, that is only one yardstick. If you then look at how harsh the African-American community was affected by the crisis, they were still massively underrepresented. So in that sense, the question is, do you look at the population split, or do you look at how the crisis affects people? And that leads to very different results. And I think it would be wrong to argue that the New Dealers were the goodies in these stories who really tried to improve things and fight for a more equal American society. And then there were conservative villains who stopped them. No, I think there is many New Dealers, particularly again, as I mentioned before, in the South, who very much embraced New Deal policies, but also held on to the situation as was. And again, as you rightly described, quite a few of these programs that were created had a racial bias in the sense that they very much had a focus on a specific part of the American population. It's not just the race issue, it's also a gender issue and an occupational issue. So it's very much about the male white industrial breadwinner. And if you look at policies such as Social Security, again, we all know about the big discussion of Obamacare, but the holes were, of course, much bigger in Social Security and social policies before the New Deal. But what the New Dealers created actually was a policy that very much focused on male white industrial breadwinners. So also if you were a female farmer in the country, or kind of farm worker, farm hand in the countryside, maybe even white, these policies were not for you. So in also that sense, there was a very clear focus, which in my book I also describe as a certain idea that kind of ties in with a high modernist version and vision of society, that if you help the male breadwinner, you would lift up families. If you help the industrial sector, that would very much also lift the whole society further up and overcome the crisis. And that also, of course, white voters mattered more for, again, these constituencies with gerrymandering and all the problems that persist to this day. So in that sense, also there, insulation has a very problematic racial dimension or racist dimension to it that I think we also sometimes in the more benign stories of the New Deal, such as Schlessinger's, for instance, where race doesn't really figure prominently, tend to neglect. And I think it's very important, and rightly so, that this dimension and the problematic legacies of the New Deal have become much more prominent in recent research than they were 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, just following on from that. So is it a modernization? I mean, is it an invention of a modernity?
That's a tricky one. It very much depends on how you define the term, I should say.
Yeah, sure.
So what I think is that there was a very modernist version and vision of society. Right. And again, the idea that you had is also one that modernization theory, which then became very powerful in the early post-war period by people like Rustow and others, was, I think, already driving some New Deal policies avant la lettre. What do I mean with this? Mm-hmm. So there was this idea that also drove New Deal policymaking, that societies were basically somewhat similar, and they were basically all like on a ladder, sitting somewhere on an equation. And there were clear economic indicators that could see where you were on that ladder to progress and to prosperity. Right. And the idea was to learn also from those that were further up on that ladder and to basically lift oneself up by doing that. And that is very much the social engineering spirit I would also see in many of the New Deal planners of the early part of the 1930s. People like Barbara Armstrong, for instance, a professor in California, who was an expert of social policy making and could pride herself in having not only researched, but also visited many of the social policy programs across Europe, who felt that there was a lot to be learned. And again, America was lagging behind. It's also that very language of lagging behind, as if there was one universal standard. And again, you can only move up or down. There is no sideways movements possible, basically, that was driving these policy programs at the time. So in that sense, I think modernism was very much at the heart of New Deal thinking. And the idea was certainly to modernize society. Again, I think from my perspective...
I just want to jump in there. Sorry, I mean, dialogue, because it's because that was actually one of the things that struck me. So you have a sense of the United States. We don't think of the United States thinking of itself as lagging behind. And yet You insisted on this fact. It was lagging behind. People felt, my gosh, the fascists are doing things better. The communists are doing things better. The social democrats in Sweden are doing things better. And yet, out of this comes a sense that we do things better. And allied to that is something else that you say in your book, which I was reading yesterday rereading, I should say, yesterday with a great interest, is also that America starts to look like the America we think of today in what you're describing as the second phase. No, you get the roads being built, you get the gas stations, you get question mark.
Exactly. Again, on the first part, this is exactly the argument, and that's the paradox that is quite difficult to see at first glance, that again, by looking around and also turning one's country into a global laboratory where ideas from elsewhere are being discussed and then piecemeal adaptation takes place, America becomes the America that we tend to see today. Again, America post-New Deal looks much more similar to the America that we know today, that many of us have traveled to or lived in, than the America of 1920, for instance, again, with public infrastructure and many other dimensions of policymaking and debates. And again, my point is less that America was de facto lagging behind. What I found much more interesting is to see that spirit and mindset of the New Dealers. And again, to some extent, I think this was really heartfelt, that they felt, okay, there is a problem, we need to sort this, we are lagging behind. To some extent, I think there is also a tactical dimension that if you're an expert in the University of California, Santa Barbara, wherever, or at some other of these top schools that then start to influence new policy making, your access to, again, the president, to the administration is also easier if you have an argument of that kind, if you cannot come up with a clear policy solution. And again, the New Dealers were less kind of following this exceptionalist stance of American thinking, that America is fundamentally different, that nothing can be learned from other countries. Again, a position that, for instance, Judge Scalia also in the 2000s had in the Supreme Court, that American legal tradition is fundamentally different than anyone else's, but that was not powerful, comparably less powerful at the time. And that, I think, can only be explained with this experience of crisis and insecurity as that was triggered by the Great Depression. And that also, I think, is so interesting because it makes that America, again, on the one hand, so similar, but also so different to the America today, where, again, particularly over the past years under Trump, self-confidence and pride and ideas about America's global role without trying to really be globally active were looming so large. And that, I think, is an interesting comparison also that history can bring to the table.
And last question, really. You quoted a very large number of people who have recently been using, perhaps in a superficial way, the words global, the New Deal and various kinds of New Deal. But you did say that there is this interest in the word. The word has survived. The concept survived because it indicates a high level of mobilization, a degree of domestic intervention, the impact that it had on public discussion, and the point you were making at the end. Do you think the fact that we are now talking of a Green New Deal, we're talking of the need for a New Deal for Europe in one way or another to get out of the recession and get out to revitalize the European project, to link things back to your other more recent book? Are we seeing is it a flashing light on the dashboard to indicate that we are moving back towards more statist solutions and more activist solutions, and we're expecting governments or international organizations or political actors to do more because they have not done enough?
So I have two arguments, I think, in an attempt to answer your great question, Mark. I think, firstly, probably there wouldn't be 1 year in the global history since 1945 for which you wouldn't find a policy actor in one corner of the world or the other who argued for the need of a New Deal. So in that sense, the language has become global and the icon therefore also utterly vague, if you will. But I think the very fact that we see more important players and also more important programs using this rhetoric indicates that, yes, to a good extent, we are living in a different time than, say, 10, 15 years ago. I personally think, again, I'm speaking to some extent as a citizen, but also certainly as a historian, that the heyday of neoliberalism and kind of liberal solutions to policy issues and economic affairs tends to be over. And I think that the corona pandemic also probably will re-emphasize that other dimension of more active state or more active forms of governance. I'm not just talking about state in the traditional sense, but also want to include international organizations. So in that sense, I think we'll probably see a lot more of this rhetoric in coming years, because it is so far powerful. And again, because policy solutions tend to go into that direction. So in that sense, it's a little bit like a snowball system. You have a rhetoric that once you have an atmosphere and a political economic climate that also is open to these ideas, gain traction. And that also, of course, creates policies that, again, in the snowball system, again, makes the rhetoric more powerful and vice versa. So in that sense, it can become stronger. And I think this is what we've seen over recent years. Second point, again, I would want to stress that this is not kind of the New Deal 2.0, that the policy solutions that are being discussed are quite different. Again, the Green New Deal, looking at the last slide that I showed you, has rather little to do with New Deal policies. There were also environmental concerns amongst New Dealers, but if you use the American terminology, there is the difference between conservationists and preservationists. And Teddy Roosevelt, the other earlier president in US American history, is very famously a conservationist, which means that basically the idea was to use the natural resources in a slightly more efficient way. So you wouldn't go for exploitation, but you would certainly do all you could to make profit and exploit the economy in a slightly more sustainable way. Now, preservationism is more about really wilderness, for instance, and keeping nature intact. And what we see is that certainly these days, the discussion is formatted in very different ways, where again, ideas also about the urgency of this issue and also keeping, or restoring some parts of the issues that have completely gone out of balance has become much more important than the New Deal policy program. So in that sense, also there, the reference can't be too strong. And the third and last point I want to make is that, if you will, it is also so interesting how few other global icons and words and catchwords of this kind we actually have. So if you will, again, we're all sitting, or you and I at least are sitting in Europe. You have a nice Chinese drawing, I think, behind you. You have already had a session on the Silk and Belt Road Initiative. But if we try to think of experiences, for instance, just for one moment in European history, that could be positively referred to as a mobilizing program for any kind of political action of whatever sort, if you will, or contents, I think there is not so much that comes to mind. What you sometimes have is the Marshall Plan, again, a US-American initiative that is also being cited. And sometimes you have also mixes in the rhetoric that it's a kind of Marshall Plan New Deal solution. So that is also often really very closely connected to the talk about the New Deal. There are things like the Beveridge Plan, for instance, for the United Kingdom, but that doesn't resonate so much in other parts of Europe. And I think there is other experience in European history that people, of course, do not want to refer to. Again, for instance, from the country where I'm now speaking from, which would not be seen as role models for policymaking at the international level. So in that sense, I think that the talk about the New Deal, if you will, and that is a rather sad implication, also tells us something about the dearth of positive, democratically legitimized policy solutions at the international level that resonate with people and might also have this emotional touch to them, that it has a potentially mobilizing effect. So in that sense, again, particularly under democratic and democratically legitimized perspectives, I think the New Deal as a rhetoric, as a term, will stay with us. And we'll have to see if there is other formats and terms that can also rival it. And it is also a bit sad that there aren't more of this kind, not because I dislike the New Deal, obviously not, but rather because it also shows that there is a lack of positive points of reference in history, at least at the more international level of these kind of policy solutions.
But in any event, sorry, I can't resist adding something. I was going to conclude here, but in any event, it does provide a concept that people can use as a kind of collage, something you can mobilize around. If there is a leader, and this was actually the question, I meant to ask you this question before, but I forgot about it. Roosevelt is an American figure, but he's also a global figure, isn't he? I'm trying hard to think of a European leader, maybe Churchill or de Gaulle, I suppose, but very few European leaders have had this name recognition across the world and that people have sort of wanted to emulate, no?
Very much so. Again, unfortunately, European history is quite full with negative examples of policy leaders that have led the world into directions that we don't want to go back to. So in that sense, that is what European history, unfortunately, is good at, but not so much at the positive examples. And my argument is that it was also very much because of the New Deal that Roosevelt was able to play that role, not for the obvious reason that he was the president and it was his policies, but also because America, let's remind us of that, didn't have that global role that it then acquired post-45 in 1933 when it became president. And I think it wasn't clear that it was then to become that global power of leadership in just about a decade from then. So in that sense, also there, I agree with you that, again, his name resonates globally. And it was also because of the kind of new mobilization that the New Deal stands for and created, that he plays this role. And of course, also because America then continued to play such a powerful role globally post-45. If that had not been the case, I think few of us, besides you and me and a few other historians, would be remembering the New Deal. And that also explains this legacy and the constant mobilization of this rhetoric, as well as America's global role, why this term resonates with people across the globe also today.
Kiran, I think we're out of time. That was absolutely terrific. I can only hope we can do this or some other topic, perhaps on Project Europe at another time in the near future, preferably when we can go out for dinner afterwards and celebrate. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of SAIS and on behalf of our community for such a fascinating lecture.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And again, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to come be with all of you. And I would have loved to hear also and see the audience and engage with you more directly. Let's have a moment to do that, right?
Well, I hope we'll be able to work on something along those lines.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.